One day, I just asked myself, would I still like my favorite games that I played while growing up if I started playing them today instead? Well, let's just find out. Starting from the beginning with Donkey Kong Country, one of the first games that I've ever played. When I was a kid, consoles were really expensive and my parents couldn't afford one. So all of my experience with this game as a kid was playing it in arcade machines in party places. This game is the one game that made me fall in love with games. And it was all because I loved gorillas and I saw Donkey Kong and felt like trying it. I had limited time to play it, but also there were no memory cards in those machines. So every time that I boot up Donkey Kong Country, I had to learn how to flawlessly play it to beat it before my lives ran out. It was a test of patience for sure. The farthest that I got while playing this game in arcade machines was the mine level. Because not only the level was hell by itself, but the arcade machines also had an insane input delay of nearly a whole second. So those stutter jumps were nearly impossible to perform. It wasn't until I was 12 and went back to the game that I finally beat it. Now, I've talked about Donkey Kong Country in this channel, and it goes without saying that it does hold up incredibly well. It aged pretty well as far as gameplay, level design and controls go, and even visually with its cartoonish art style. This game is a timeless classic that is always worth revisiting, and it's not a hassle to get into for someone who hasn't played it before. Now, the other game that I loved playing in the arcade machines was Sonic the Hedgehog for the Genesis. Some people criticize this game saying that Sonic is too slow, but understand that if this was the start of the series for you, Sonic was still crazy fast, especially when compared to other platforming game protagonists. It's just that the traditional platforming level design forced players to take constant breaks, wait and wait. Which is funny considering that sometimes Sonic engages in his idle, impatient animation if you play the game properly. One thing that can't be understated about Sonic the Hedgehog is that it has a banger of a soundtrack. Which it should be expected with it being one of the most important Sega titles, providing us with some iconic tracks such as Green Hill Zone and Starlight Zone, which was even played during the opening of the Tokyo Olympics. Overall, the game still holds up pretty well with good controls and being easy to get into for someone new to it. However, it does have a few levels that might feel like hell, and Sonic, not being as fast or responsive as he would become later down the line, can be a bit frustrating. Those aspects reach perfection in Sonic 3. So there is an argument that Sonic 3 does everything that Sonic 1 does but better. But as a standalone game, Sonic the Hedgehog still holds up pretty well. The first console that I've ever owned was a Dreamcast. The game that I spent the most time playing on it was Sonic Adventure 2. By now, you should have realized that I might be a bit of a Sonic fan. And while some people might hate 3D Sonic games, I don't mind them at all. Now, this was during my rad era, when skating, doing backflips and handstands were all the fuss for me. And I'll be honest, I know that by now we just look at him like one edgy boy, but seeing Shadow's run animation for the first time was one of the coolest things that I saw as a kid. The one thing that always disappointed me as a kid was that Tails was by far my favorite character in the Sonic franchise, and I was super excited to play as him, only to realize that I was forced to play him on a Mac. Yeah. Also, at this point, I barely knew a single word of English. So figuring out the Knuckles levels with zero instructions was an experience. Now this game is a tough one for me because as much as I love it, I feel like there are many aspects that make it rough for people that revisit or play it for the first time. Of course, we could talk about the graphics, but I feel like that is expected when talking about 3D games from that era. 99.9% of the early 3D era games don't hold up particularly well in terms of visuals. However, the camera is probably the game's biggest problem. It doesn't really follow the action well sometimes, and the game can be a bit nauseating for people who have a tendency of getting motion sick. The mech and item finding missions can also be a bit boring. However, the controls are still great and the game feels decently responsive. Overall, I say that it aged somewhere from poorly to okay. It's time for me to cheat a bit, okay? The games that I will talk about from now on are not ones that I played during my childhood years, but rather my pre-adolescent and teenage years. For some of you, it might be the same thing, but not for me. However, if I were only to include games that I played up until I was 10, the sample size would have been way too small. Now, what kind of game 12-year-olds love? Yeah, that's right, first-person shooters. My first experience with a first-person shooter, which to this day is one of my favorite games of all time, was Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare. For both the multiplayer and the single player, you shouldn't expect any issues with controls or responsiveness, as this is a pretty modern game that was released during the 7th generation of consoles. For the single player, I feel like Call of Duty 4 aged pretty well. The campaign is great and more in line with the traditional form of storytelling that the series had back in the day, where you were just an average G.I. Joe with no face, no personality sticking out, and no choice but to follow your orders. While it does have some of the action movie absurdity, it is a lot more grounded than the campaigns that were yet to come. The main issue that you might find for the multiplayer is finding servers that are alive and well. But other than that, it is probably one of the Call of Duties that has aged the best. It does have a very defined gun and perk meta, but it's nowhere near as unbalanced as games like Modern Warfare 2 were. Only having 3 kill streaks makes a huge difference, as the game is not as snowbally as later Call of Duties. The gunplay is still pretty nice and overall it is still good fun to this day, as long as you find servers. When I brought up the topic of Call of Duty 4 to a friend at school, he told me that he didn't have that game on his PS3, but he did play a lot of Metal Gear Solid 4 and Metal Gear Solid Online 2. He told me about the story of Metal Gear and how great it was, so I had to give the series a try. I didn't have a PS3, so I had to pick up from one of the PS2 games. I didn't know where to start, so I picked the closest one to 4, Metal Gear Solid 3. And what an introduction to the series it was. Not only starting with Metal Gear Solid 3 makes perfect sense in terms of the chronological order of the events of the Metal Gear series, but 3 is also widely considered one of the best games in the series. The presentation, the story, the music, the characters, the level design and settings are some of the best in the whole series. It is also probably one of the best looking PlayStation 2 games ever. Now, there were 2 versions of Metal Gear Solid released on the PS2. The first one was the vanilla one with a fixed camera, much like the one from Metal Gear Solid 1 and 2. The second version was the Subsistence one, which had many tweaks, the most important one being the tracking camera. I played both, and needless to say that the Subsistence version was my favorite. The improved camera does wonders to this game, to the point that it's easy to forget that the Vanilla 3 had a fixed camera. Overall, the game aged very well. The only thing that is clearly outdated is the way that the shooting controls work. Firing from third person is easy enough, but can be fairly imprecise, and Snake can't hit headshots in this mode. So in order to land headshots or aim precisely at targets that are hard to hit in third person, you got to press the first person mode button, hold the shooting button, aim the gun, and then release the shooting button to shoot. It is a bit weird to get used to, but other than that, the game feels great to play even today. Finally, playing on a budget PC around the COD 4 era, I didn't have a whole lot of options as far as new games went. But there was a relatively recently released game that I could play on PC without getting 5 FPS. S.T.A.L.K.E.R, Shadow of Chernobyl. S.T.A.L.K.E.R, Shadow of Chernobyl does a great job in making its world feel alive. The anomalies, the radiation and the mutants make you feel like the zone is fighting against you. The faction system and the fame system add more flavor to the world. And not only the player but also the NPCs outside the safe haven locations have a chance of running into conflict with mutants or enemy factions at random. They can even die from it, so whenever you find an NPC that offers a quest out in the world, it's probably best to complete it as quickly as possible. But despite all of this, when talking about the vanilla version of Shadow of Chernobyl, I have to say that the game aged somewhat poorly. Playing the vanilla version can be really confusing for newcomers, with inaccurate guns, spongy enemies, and things like weapon durability and jamming. Not to mention the constant stutters and crashes that are inherent to the game's engine, and the game's overall jankiness. However, if you can get over all of that, or just don't mind at least installing some mods that fix the guns, go for it. S.T.A.L.K.E.R is an incredibly underrated series in the West that deserves some love.
Get out of here, Stalker.
I said come in, don't stand there.
If you liked the video, please like, subscribe and leave a comment down below telling me which were your favorite childhood games. And thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.